Okay, so we go to chapter 35. Differences in economic development between countries. Over time, most economies develop, allowing poverty to fall, living standards to rise, and people to have more choices. So when we talk about economic development, basically we're talking about living standards increasing or improving, poverty rate falling, and people now have more choices to make than what they used to have. This is what economic development is about. Choices for customers increases, living standards improved, poverty starts falling. That is development. Yes. So go down. Economic development. Are you there? Yes. Economic development is wider than economic growth. Besides improved living standards, it also involves reducing poverty, expanding the range of economic and social choices, and increasing freedom and self-esteem. As an economy develops, the economic welfare of its population increases. At first, the availability of basic life-sustaining products increases. Then, consumption levels rises beyond those needed for survival, and people have more choices of what to consume, where to live, and where to work. So when talking about economic development, for economic growth, they said economic growth is different from economic development. Why? Because when we talk about economic growth, we're talking about growth. Yeah, when we talk about economic growth, we're talking about increase in output, increase in aggregate demand and aggregate supply. That's economic growth. But when it comes to economic development, this cut across the well-being of people. Living standards has to improve. Poverty rate has to fall. And choices for consumers increases. So this is not economic growth. This is economic development. For economic growth, it doesn't talk about living standard. Only about output, which increases how the GDP would increase. That is what economic growth is about. But for development, it talks about the individuals, how we have choices to make, how poverty is being alleviated, and how the living standards has improved. So I think you understand the difference between economic growth and economic development now. Economic growth is basically for GDP. And economic growth is basically for GDP. Economic development is talking about the living standards, choices for consumers, and poverty alleviation. Clear, right? Yes. Okay. So the different stages of economic development. I said most economies are developing, but their rate and level of development varies. Countries with higher income per head also usually have relatively high economic development. They tend to have higher living standards, a high proportion of workers employed in the tertiary sector, a high level of productivity, a high level of investment. So for developing economies, their level of growth is less compared to developed countries. For developed countries, because they have high income earners, they have high income, so they have high level of productivity, they have high levels of investment, because in that economy, things are working well. Yes. That's what they are trying to say here. And they have large proportion of their workers in the tertiary sector. That is developed economies. So they said, international organizations, okay, countries with lower income per head usually have lower economic development with lower living standards and number of other characteristics as explained below. So for countries with low income per head, they will have low living standard. They will have low productivity also. The international organizations classify countries in a variety of ways. The United Nations, for instance, divides countries into 4 levels of development: very high human development, high human development, medium human development, and low human development. The World Bank divides countries into high income, upper middle income, lower middle income, and low income. So this is between the United Nations and the World Bank division of or classes of economy. The UN and the World Bank. So go to measures of economic development. They said it is not easy to measure development, but a number of ways are used. A common one is real GDP per head. We talked about that before. So this does measure an important aspect of development, material living standards, but it does not measure all aspects of development, like Human Development Index. A wider measure is the Human Development Index, as explained. This measures the extent to which people are in a country achieve a long and healthy life, knowledge, and a good standard of living. So Human Development Index talk more about economic development than real GDP. That is the point they are making there. So what are the causes of differences in economic development between countries? So why do we have different economic development in different countries? They said there are a number of reasons why countries have different levels of economic development, including differences in income per head. Because if some countries with high income per head will have real GDP and will have better ways of better living standards. So look at what they said. They said economic development tends to be lower in countries with low real GDP per head. In such countries, some people may struggle to afford a good standard of living. However, this does not mean that all the people in such countries are poor. In fact, some can be very rich. So differences in income per head can also determine how developed a country is. Because here, a low income country, a low income per head, they're talking about the real GDP here. If the real GDP per head of a country is low, there's tendency to have large proportion of that people living in that country living below average. That means they might be struggling to afford the basic needs, but does not mean that everybody in that country is poor. Some might be very, very rich. Do you understand? Yes. But it's going to have a low GDP per head. So the second one, differences in saving due to differences in income per head. So poor people cannot afford to save, and so the saving ratio of a country where the average income is low is likely to be low. If savings are low, there will be lack of finance for investment. So if people cannot save, then they can't have income, they can't have wealth, and they can't invest. So a country with low income per head would definitely have a low income, a low saving opportunity. As a result, investment in such country will be less. So differences in savings also tends to lead to differences in development in the economy. Do you get the point?
Yes.
The third point, differences in investment. So countries with a low value of capital goods per worker will be likely to have low income per head. So because they have low capital goods per worker, that means there's no human resources in such country. So because there's no human resources, there's no development. Differences in population growth. So in countries with high population growth, there's usually a high dependency ratio with a high proportion of children being dependent on a small proportion of workers. This means that some of the resources which could have been used to improve the quality of life of the current population have to be used to support the extra members of the population. So countries with high population might have high dependency ratio or rate. As a result of that, resources that are supposed to be used to develop the economy will be used to sustain the economy. Do you get it?
Yes, yes.
Developing the economy is different from sustaining the economy. Sustaining the economy means that at least make sure that everybody is fine. Developing the economy is taking them away, taking them above that satisfactory extent.
Yes.
You get the point there?
Yes.
Differences in education and healthcare. So a lack of access to or poor quality of education and healthcare will reduce the quality of people's lives and will result in low level of productivity. So the differences in education and healthcare. So accessibility to healthcare, accessibility to education can determine if a country will develop than another. So differences in development in countries is also influenced by differences in how they are accessible, how education and healthcare is accessible.
Yes.
Clear?
Yes.
Differences in the size of the primary, secondary, and tertiary sector. So economic growth and the quality of people's working conditions tend to be lower. Economic growth and the quality of people's working conditions tend to be lower the greater the proportion of the workers employed in the primary sector. So in the primary sector, the working condition is less because the primary sector does not generate more revenue, unlike the secondary or the tertiary sector. So the level of income in the primary sector is lesser than that in the secondary sector, and that in the secondary sector is lesser than that of the tertiary sector. So if an economy is depending mostly on the primary sector, that means the economy will not develop like that one that is depending on the secondary sector or the tertiary sector. So that is the point there.
Yes.
So reliance of countries in each of the sector of the economy will determine how developed they can become. Is it clear?
Yes.
Differences in the concentration on a narrow range of exports, most of which are primary products. Countries that export a narrow range of products can be adversely affected by large decreases in demand or decrease in supply. The demand for manufactured goods and services tend to increase more than the demand for primary products in income as income increases. So if a country wants to reach high development, it has to focus on exporting secondary sector products or exporting services. If you are reliant on primary sector, it's less income. Clear? Differences in productivity. There's a country with a lower output per worker hour will tend to have low income per head, and so may have, for instance, lower education and healthcare. So level of productivity also can determine how a country can develop or not develop. Is it clear? So why governments seek to achieve economic development? Let's take that. Let me see it. No.
We have low income savings.
Okay, yeah, it's easy. They said low income. If there's low income, it will lead to low savings. Low savings will lead to low investment. Low investment will lead to low productivity. And if productivity is low, income will be low. So we're talking about it's cyclical. This is basically the circle of poverty. We call it the circle of poverty. Poverty starts with low productivity, low invest. Everything cut across low, low, low. If income is low, savings will be low. If savings are low, investment will be low. If investment is low, productivity will be low. So a country that has low income will have low investment. Will have low savings. A country with low savings will have low investment. A country with low investment will have low productivity. Is it clear?
Yes.
So we stop here for this class.
Yeah.